Some people enter your life so quietly that you don't notice the exact moment they arrive. There is no dramatic beginning, no unforgettable conversation, no instant realization that this person will matter. They simply appear somewhere inside the ordinary rhythm of your days, and at first, they seem no different from anyone else. That is exactly what I thought. Just another person, another conversation, another temporary presence that would eventually fade into memory like so many others before. But something unexpected happened. You didn't disappear, you remained. Not in an obvious way, not through constant attention, not through effort. You simply stayed. And slowly, without me realizing it, your presence started appearing in places I never intended to share with anyone, in unfinished thoughts, in quiet moments, in the spaces between one idea and the next. Something would happen during the day, and before I even understood why, my mind would turn toward you. Not intentionally. It simply happened. At first, I ignored it. I convinced myself it was normal. The mind creates patterns. It connects unrelated experiences. It assigns meaning where there may be none. So I explained it away. I called it curiosity. I called it familiarity. I called it a temporary fascination that would eventually disappear. But it didn't. The more time passed, the more natural your presence became. You stopped feeling like an interruption. You became a reference point. And there is a difference. An interruption captures your attention for a moment. A reference point quietly changes the way you see everything else. I would hear an interesting idea and wonder what you would think about it. I would notice something unusual and immediately imagine how you might interpret it. Sometimes I would experience something completely unrelated to you, and somehow my thoughts would still move in your direction. That should have told me something, but I wasn't ready to understand it, because understanding would have required admitting that something inside me was already changing, and I wasn't prepared for that. I've always been careful about who I allow close, not because I dislike people, not because I fear connection. I've simply learned that there are parts of ourselves that should not be handed out carelessly. So over time, I built distance, not visible distance, tenal distance, a quiet place where I remained entirely my own. Most people never reached that place. They knew me, they spoke with me, they spent time around me, but there was always a final door that remained closed, a part of me reserved only for myself, and for years, that arrangement worked perfectly. Until you. The strange thing is that you never tried to cross any boundaries. You never forced your way into my life. You never demanded explanations. You never pushed for closeness. You simply paid attention. And somehow, that was enough. Maybe that's why I didn't resist. There was nothing to resist. You weren't trying to enter a locked room. You were simply standing near the door, patently, quietly, without expectation. And somehow your presence made the door feel less necessary. That was unfamiliar. Distant had always given me clarity. Distant gives you control. When there is space between people, everything feels predictable. You know what belongs to you. You know what belongs to them. You know where the boundaries exist. But something unusual happens when someone begins to understand you without demanding access to you. The boundaries remain, yet they stop feeling like walls. They become transparent, still present, still real, but no longer separating you in the same way. That is what happened slowly. Then all at once, I began noticing small things, the pauses in your voice, the moments when you chose silence instead of easy answers, the way you observed before reacting, the way you allowed uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to solve it. Most people rush toward conclusions. Most people need everything explained. Most people feel uncomfortable when something remains unresolved. You weren't like that. You allowed complexity to stay complex. You allowed silence to stay silent. You didn't reduce everything into something easier to understand. And that made me notice you, because being misunderstood is common. Most people experience it every day. People hear your words but rarely hear your meaning. They create an idea of who you are and then spend the rest of the conversation talking to that idea, not to you. But you did something different. You left room for me to remain complicated. You didn't rush to define me. You didn't try to simplify me. You simply observed. And that felt surprisingly rare. For the first time in a long time, I felt understood without feeling exposed. That's a difficult thing to explain. Most people assume understanding comes from asking questions, from gathering information, from uncovering secrets. But real understanding often comes from attention, from noticing what exists beneath the surface, from hearing what isn't being said. And somehow, you seemed capable of doing that naturally. That was when awareness began. Not love, not certainty, just awareness. I became aware of you. Then I became aware that I was aware of you. And once that happened, I couldn't ignore it anymore, because awareness changes things. Once you truly notice something, you can't honestly return to not noticing it. You can distract yourself. You can pretend it doesn't matter. But you cannot unknow what you've already seen. And I had seen something. Not perfection, not destiny, something much simpler. Recognition. You felt familiar, not because you reminded me of someone, not because we shared the same past. We didn't. It was something deeper than that. Something about the way your mind worked, the way you observed before reacting, the way you looked beneath obvious answers, the way you seemed comfortable with silence, the way you questioned easy explanations, the way you understood that complicated things do not become simple just because we want them to. It wasn't the details, it was the structure, the architecture of your thinking, and somehow it felt familiar. I didn't notice it all at once. I discovered it gradually, one conversation at a time, one observation at a time, a shared pause, a similar question, a familiar way of seeing the world. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was projecting. Maybe I was seeing myself where no real similarity existed. So I paid attention. I watched carefully. I waited. I observed how you responded when conversations became uncomfortable. I noticed whether silence made you restless. I noticed whether you rushed toward conclusions. I noticed whether your actions matched your words. And every time I expected the pattern to break, it didn't. You simply remained yourself. And consistency is difficult to ignore. A coincidence can explain one moment, maybe even two, but consistency forces you to consider that what you're seeing may actually be real. That realization stayed with me because it suggested something I wasn't prepared to admit. You weren't simply someone who understood certain things about me. You seemed to understand the way I understood things. And that is different, much more personal. Because when someone understands your conclusions, you can still keep your process hidden. But when someone understands the process itself, they begin getting closer without ever taking a single step forward. And somehow that was happening without effort, without pressure, without intention. I found myself wondering what it meant, not what it meant for us. I wasn't ready for that question. I wondered what it meant about me. Why did your presence feel different? Why did certain conversations remain in my mind long after they ended? Why did I remember details I would normally forget? Why did your perspective matter before you had even shared it? Those questions became impossible to ignore because they pointed toward a truth I had been avoiding. You were becoming important, not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly, without permission, without announcement. You had become part of my internal world, a place very few people ever reached. And for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to push someone out of that space. I was trying to understand why they belonged there. The moment I realized you had become important, I tried to explain it, not to anyone else, to myself. I wanted a reason, a clear answer, something logical I could point to and say, that's why. But the more I searched for an explanation, the more complicated everything became. Because some things don't enter your life through logic, they enter through recognition, and recognition is difficult to describe. You don't decide it, you don't create it, you simply experience it. It's the strange feeling of meeting someone who seems to exist on a frequency you've been listening for your entire life without realizing it. Not because they're identical to you, they're not, in many ways. We were completely different. Different experiences, different histories, different perspectives. But beneath those differences, there was something familiar, something impossible to measure, a quiet understanding. And the more I noticed it, the more it changed me, not because you were trying to change me. You never were. The most powerful influences in life rarely arrive with intentions. They simply exist. And their existence forces you to see yourself differently. That's what happened. For years, I thought I understood who I was. I thought my boundaries were permanent. My habits were permanent. My perspective was permanent. I believed growth happened in dramatic moments, major decisions, life-changing events. But now I was experiencing something entirely different, a transformation so gradual that I could barely see it happening. And yet every day, I was becoming someone new. The strange part was that nothing about my life looked different from the outside. The same routines, the same responsibilities, the same world. Yet internally, everything felt wider. Questions appeared where certainty once existed. Possibilities appeared where conclusions once lived. And for the first time in years, I felt curiosity returning. Not curiosity about facts, curiosity about life, about people, about myself. Because that's what genuine connection does. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you better questions. Questions you didn't know you needed. Questions that reveal parts of yourself you've never explored. Questions that make the future feel larger than the past. And once those questions appear, everything changes. You begin noticing things. Bart taunts. Assumptions. Invisible rules you've been living by for years. Rules you never consciously chose. Rules inherited from old experiences. Old disappointments. Old fears. And suddenly you realize how much of your life has been built around protection. Protection from uncertainty. Protection from vulnerability. Protection from disappointment. Protection from change. At first, that realization was uncomfortable, because protection feels safe, it feels intelligent, it feels responsible. But eventually I understood something important. Protection and growth rarely move in the same direction. Growth requires uncertainty. Growth requires risk. Growth requires stepping beyond the limits you've created for yourself, and for years, I had been doing the opposite, not intentionally, but consistently. I had been building walls and calling them wisdom, creating distance and calling it independence, avoiding uncertainty and calling it strength. Then you appeared, and without even trying, you made me question everything, not because you argued against my beliefs, because your existence exposed them. That's the power of perspective. Sometimes a single person can reveal limitations you've spent years pretending aren't there, not through criticism, not through advice, simply by showing you another way of being, another way of seeing, another way of moving through the world. And suddenly your reality no longer feels complete, not because it's wrong, because it's unfinished. That realization changed everything, because unfinished means growth is still possible. Unfinished means the story isn't over. Unfinished means there are still versions of yourself waiting to be discovered. For years, I thought self-discovery was something people talked about. Now I understood it was something people lived. Every day, every conversation, every choice, Every realization, the person you become isn't created all at once. They're revealed gradually, layer by layer, truth by truth, until one day you look back and barely recognize the person you used to be. I think that's what was happening, not because I wanted it, because I could no longer stop it. Awareness had already begun, and awareness changes everything. Once you become aware of a possibility, you cannot return to ignorance. Once you recognize a limitation, you cannot pretend it doesn't exist. Once you see a larger version of yourself, the smaller version becomes impossible to accept. That's the gift and the burden of growth. It expands your world, but it also destroys your excuses. And I had run out of excuses. I could no longer blame circumstances, or timing, or other people, because the only thing standing between me and a larger future was my willingness to move toward it. That realization terrified me, and liberated me at the same time, because freedom isn't comfortable. Real freedom comes with responsibility, the responsibility to choose, the responsibility to change, the responsibility to become. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready, not certain ready. There's a difference. Certainty demands guarantees. Readiness accepts uncertainty. Certainty waits until the path is visible. Readiness starts walking before it is. And maybe that's what growth has always been. Not knowing, moving anyway, not certainty. Courage, not answers. Trust. The trust that the next version of yourself exists somewhere beyond your current understanding, waiting, patently, for you to meet them. I don't know exactly when everything changed. Maybe there wasn't a single moment, maybe transformation never happens that way. Maybe it's simply a collection of small realizations that eventually become impossible to ignore. A conversation, a thought, a question, a perspective, a person, each one adding something invisible until suddenly your entire world looks different. And that's why I no longer ask why you became important. The answer doesn't matter anymore. Some things aren't meant to be explained, only understood. What matters is what happened because of it. I became more aware, more honest, more curious, more willing to challenge the limits I once accepted, more willing to grow beyond the person I thought I had to be. And maybe that's the greatest gift one person can give another. Not love, not validation, not certainty, awareness, the ability to see yourself more clearly than before, because once you truly see yourself, everything changes. The choices you make change. The future you imagine changes. The life you're willing to create changes. And eventually, you change. That's what I understand now. Some people enter your life to stay. Some enter your life to leave. And some enter your life for a completely different reason. They arrive to wake something up inside you. A forgotten curiosity, a hidden possibility, a future version of yourself, waiting to be discovered. And whether they remain forever or only for a season becomes irrelevant, because their purpose was never to complete your story. Their purpose was to begin a new chapter, a chapter where you stop living inside old limitations, a chapter where you stop protecting smaller versions of yourself, a chapter where growth becomes more important than certainty. And looking back now, I realize that was never really about you. It was about who I became after meeting you, because in the end, the most important people in our lives aren't always the ones who stay forever. Sometimes, they're the ones who remind us that we are capable of becoming more than we ever imagined. And once you learn that lesson, you never see yourself the same way again.